Hey, what's up? Welcome to my parents' house. I'm home visiting for the holidays, which means I don't have access to my bookshelf in progress, but I do have my Kindle, which has Google Sheets where I keep track of everything that I read. I wanted to go through and see if I could talk very quickly about every single thing that I read this year. I read over 80 books, and I was thinking how I wanted to classify what a book is. To me, these books are going to be anything that is a fiction, a memoir, a history, a collection of poetry, a play. I'm using kind of like a wide definition, but I really quickly, today I had broken up everything that I had read this year into these a handful of categories and wanted to see if I can keep it to 8 to 10 minutes talking about 84 books that I read. So I wanted to start off at the top with the very first thing I read this year, which was In the Land of Invisible Women by Qanta Ahmed. This is a book that is the chronicling of a Pakistani British woman who was previously working as a doctor in the United States and is hired in Saudi Arabia in the late 90s. The book is all about her experience in her handful of years living in Riyadh, the capital, her experience with a Saudi Arabia that is in some ways resistant to change, but in other ways very progressive and making leaps and bounds for the Middle East. So it was interesting to me because I spent about a month traveling through Saudi Arabia at the beginning of the year, and while I found a lot of her observations were out of date, it was still tremendous to read and hear her opinion. We're already at a minute and a half, so we got to speed things up. The next category I would like to talk about are India and the Indian diaspora. I read a handful of tremendous books while I was traveling in India in February. I always love to hit up local bookshops, and gratefully I was in two phenomenal literary cities this year, both Bombay and Bangalore. So I picked up The Lost Flamingoes of Bombay by Siddharth Dhanvant Shanghvi. I got this at Tidal Waves in Mumbai, which was a phenomenal bookstore with a cafe attached to it. Really liked that a lot. It was the very first place I went after I got off the plane in Mumbai. Los Flamingos is a tremendous kind of summary of what Bombay is across the 20th and 21st century. We've got Bollywood, we have crime and intrigue, we have sexual politics, and we have the general kind of exploration of the malaise of what does it even mean to be Indian, especially in such a cosmopolitan and global city like Bombay. Other books I want to put on your radar would be Chikkamma Tours Private Limited by Unmana. She uses a mononym, Unmana, and I got this at Goobe's in Bangalore, which is a phenomenal bookstore. I got so many books from them that I would buy, read, bring back in. The owner let me trade for more. Really enjoyed Chikkamma Tours Private Limited. It's an ode to the Bangalore bookstores through a murder mystery. I also picked up Perumal Murugan's One Part Woman, which was a tremendous introduction to me to Tamil culture, and Jerry Pinto's M and the Big Hoom, which is a really moving family drama about a woman who is clearly dealing with both mental illnesses, but also just a really horrifying personality in the way that it has ramifications for her entire family. It's a really disturbing and moving novel. Once I started reading it, I couldn't put it back down, and that's how I spent the majority of the time that I spent in Madurai. Koral Dasgupta has written an incredible series of novels called the Sati series, which are all modern feminist retellings of ancient Indian folklore mythology. So I read Tara, which has a lot to do with the scenes with Hanuman from the Ramayana. Later this year, I actually read R.K. Narayan, a huge South Indian author, his 1972 modern prose adaptation of the Ramayana, which I highly recommend for anyone trying to learn about Hinduism and the Vedic texts for the very first time. Abraham Verghese's The Covenant of Water. This is an Oprah book pick. This is that huge, monstrous book. You can even buy this in big box stores everywhere you go. It was recommended to me by the guys at Goobe's. Highly recommend. This is like an 800-page drama with the unfolding of the end of the British Raj, which I always love reading about the destruction of the British Raj. And then, of course, the the Man Booker Prize buzz from earlier this year, Banu Mushtaq's Heart Lamp, which is all about women in the Muslim cultures of South India. I believe she's from Karnataka. Tremendous. I read that through my library card at Ithra, which is in Saudi Arabia. It is a massive cultural center that is funded by Saudi Aramco. So thanks to that. The next subject of books that I read this year was about China and the Chinese diaspora. Towards the end of my big digital nomad abroad journey from the beginning of the year, I went to Taiwan, and we can definitely get into the politics of whether or not Taiwan is China. I'd love to talk about that with anyone who will listen, but I read a couple of tremendous Taiwanese novels. One is from the early 2000s called Faraway by Lo Yi-Chin. This is about a man who has lived his whole life in Taiwan, and his father back in the mainland has passed away, and he has to go back to the mainland to tie up loose ends, and all of the drama with him trying to understand the grave differences at that time between Taiwan and mainland China. And then also Bestiary by K-Ming. She is an incredibly young author. This was her debut. It is a tribute to the indigenous religion of Taiwan and its indigenous people. I found a very fascinating book at the Philly Age Thrift earlier this year. Christopher New's Shanghvi. This is a 1985 epic covering the entire history of Britain's involvement in Shanghai through the eyes of John Denton, who starts off as this young, innocent boy, never been anywhere, never done anything, and ends following the entire rise and fall of the British in China. I was nervous about reading this book because I want to hear indigenous perspectives. I didn't really think that some British guy who was a professor in Hong Kong could really impress me, and yet I was blown away by his very intimate portrayal of China. It's famously in modern times most tumultuous and revolutionary age. I read San Shui's Mother River, which is an avant-garde collection of short stories. Yan Liangke, who is a very popular Beijing author. Several of his books have been banned in the mainland. Heart Sutra is a fascinating analysis of China's 5 main religions, and we literally see them go through a tug of war that is being administered to try to raise money for a religious institute in Beijing. It's a tremendous glance at modern China's approach to religion. And I also wanted to mention the Julia Lovell translation for Monkey King Journey to the West. This came out in 2021 and is another tremendous translation for the modern reader, especially for the modern reader who is not Chinese. I really appreciated the way that she brings the ancient and timeless tale of the Monkey King for a modern audience. And lastly, if we're talking Chinese diaspora, I have to mention what I think is one of the most amazing places in the world, Malaysia. Thanks to my friend Camilla, I read Tan Tuan Eng's The House of Doors, which is a fascinating reinterpretation of a Somerset Maugham book. So there are layers here of course, anytime you talk about Malaysia, there's the layers of the Chinese diaspora in Malaysia and its effects on the indigenous various Malay peoples. But then you also have Somerset Maugham, who was a British Orientalist, and Tan Tuan Eng is taking his opportunity to look back through the lens of historical fiction and analyze all these layers of people and everything that was happening on the island of Penang off the coast of Malaysia. Okay, switching gears, let's take a break from geography and look at an entirely different style of writing. My next portion here is poetry and plays. I wanted to start off with Gil Scott-Heron's The Vulture. Now, to us Americans, we mostly know Gil Scott-Heron for his poetry. This is the only novel he wrote, to my understanding. It's a really cool look at Harlem in uptown Manhattan through the lens of a handful of different characters. The characters in here are incredible. The story is breezy. Really fun read. and I now will focus actually on poetry. So here's a bunch of poetry and plays that I read this year. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, Shakespeare's Hamlet, an entire segment of Sufi poetry from Iran, Sadi Shirazi's The Bustan, and Attar's The Conference of the Birds. I would say tangentially related to that is the Book of Dede Korkut, which comes from Central Asia. Also, this year's Poet Laureate of the United States, Arthur Z. He's got a tremendous collection called Sightlines, which is all about his beautiful tributes to the landscapes of New Mexico. And of course, Emily Dickinson's full collection of poetry, if we're talking about American poetry. Rainer Rilke's The Duino Elegies. I really could create an entire sub-headline here of books I read because of Gravity's Rainbow, which I'll get to later. This is a very dense and confusing set of 10 poems written by Rainer Rilke, who is kind of regarded as Germany's greatest poet. I read it, honestly, because I wanted to understand Gravity's Rainbow better. And then lastly here, I also wanted to talk about Hamid Ismailov's incredible novel, We Computers, which is a tribute and ode and a introduction into Persian poetry and Sufi poetry. I really recommend reading We Computers if you want to get into Sufi poetry. It helped open up the mechanics of poetry for me in an incredible way. And I've also got one last piece of poetry here that I don't want to forget, which is Linnea Axelson's Ednan. This is a Swedish epic, all dedicated to the Swami people who are indigenous to Sweden. They live in the far north, and it's their trials and tribulations in their attempt to resist Swedish colonialism. Switching topics, this year in the fall, I got into the Gothics. For the very first time ever, I wanted to go back during the Halloween season and read these classic stories. Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's Frankenstein may be my favorite book of all time that I've ever read. What more can be said about it? Please go read that. Also, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and then I had a handful of friends recommend to me Carmilla, which is J.S. Le Fanu. He was an Irish writer who popularized a lot of vampire tropes. So Carmilla is a really fun, quick vampire story to read. Let's go back to geography, shall we? I want to talk to you about Russia. I read Ludmila Ulitskaya's The Big Green Tent. This was a tremendous ode to the Russian classics. I walked away from this huge novel with a list of maybe 50 Russian and former Soviet authors that I wanted to dig into, and Ulitskaya's book really became the roadmap for me for Russian literature through the rest of the year. I figured if I'm going to get into Russian literature, I need to start with Pushkin. So I read a collection of his stories that include The Queen of Spades, and then of course Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, Nikolai Gogol's Taras Bulba, although I've been informed now that I should have gone with a different Gogol. Dead Souls is on my list for next year. Of course, I've already made a video about this, Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, and I read Alexandra Kollontais' Red Love. She was the highest ranking woman in the Soviet Union and one of the highest ranking political females in history. It was an incredible novel that explored sexual politics in the 1910s and 1920s, in the minutes after the revolution. Tangentially related to Russia would be Idris Shah's Karakush. Idris Shah, a very famous Sufi who did a lot to bring Sufism to the West and its accessibility. Karakush is a controversial novel because there are portions where people question the historical accuracy, but I think the thing about Sufism in general is that we're more concerned about the principles, the transcendent value of the writing, and less about whether this specific thing literally did happen. But it's an incredible analysis of Afghanistan's resistance against expansionist Russia during the war there in the 70s and the 80s. And another tangentially related to Russia is, I think, Russia's most famous expat, writer, especially among Americans, is Nabokov. I read him for the first time. Lolita and Panine, these books are both related to one another. They mirror each other in a lot of ways. Lolita, I think, is necessary reading, and I really loved YouTuber Shan Spear's analysis of Lolita when she said, Lolita is not the creation of a culture, it's the acknowledgement of a culture already in existence. So if you have preconceived notions about the novel, I recommend you go read it. Okay, let's do some more geography. I've got two quick sections here. One would be Korea. I read two novels by Han Kang. She is probably the name in Korean literature right now among the West, The Vegetarian and The White Book. And I also came across in Itaewon in Seoul, where I was staying in March, I visited Itaewon Foreign Books, where they had a tremendous English collection of Pak Kyung-ni's stories titled The Age of Doubt, which is the first and largest story in that collection. Tremendous meditations on what does it mean to be Korean after the Korean War, especially living in a city like Seoul, which is less than 30 miles from the DMZ. Very fascinating collection of stories. And I want to take a quick look now at Latin America. I only read two Latin American authors this year. One is Jared Lemus, who I've said before, his short story debut, Guatemalan Rhapsody, really left me wanting, but I know that this man has potential and I can't wait to see what else he writes. My favorite contemporary Latin American author is, without a doubt, Argentina's Pola Oloixarac. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing her name, but I read Dark Constellations and Mona. I read Dark Constellations at the beginning of the year. It is a confusing and very trippy avant-garde novel, whereas Mona is a sarcastic and a snappy attack on the modern literati. I really enjoyed Mona a lot. I think it's a tremendous, less than 200 pages, phenomenal book. And while I'm on the topic of less than 200 pages, I want to tell you about Short Stack, which is a book club I joined up in Philly, and we read one book a month. That's less than 200 pages, and I'm just going to run through you real quick what I read with Short Stack. Paula Fox's Desperate Characters, John Fosse's Morning and Evening, Noor Naga's If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English, Ron Hansen's Marietta in Ecstasy, Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, Sarah Levine's Treasure Island, Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, Banana Yoshimoto's Kitchen. Check out Short Stack, even if you don't live in Philly. Just good book recs. In the pan-Arab world, I want to talk about Leila Abu Leila's The Translator. She won some major literary awards this year, and her books were recommended to me by Saki Books, which is a London-based book imprint and bookseller that really focuses on the Middle East and telling Arab stories. The Translator is a tremendous story of a Sudanese woman falling in love with her Scottish boss. Also, Ala al-Aswani's The Yacubian Building, which is set in early 2000s Cairo. And if we're talking about Cairo, we have to talk about Naguib Mahfouz, who was a hugely prominent and important Egyptian writer in the middle of the 20th century. I read a 3-book collection of his, which included The Beggar, The Thief and the Dogs, and Autumn Quail. Really tremendous. The thing I have noticed a lot about Arab literature, if I had to make a one-sentence statement about it, is that Arab literature does a tremendous job of conveying grief and mourning and missing something and lost potential. It's incredible. That's a theme that I see repeated so many times over again when I read Arab and Middle Eastern literature. Okay, folks, we're getting close to the end here, and we're already almost twice as long as I wanted this to be. Let's talk about some American classics, folks. Bring it up and salute for James Luceno's Darth Plagueis. Sure. The Phantom Menace. What was going on in that film? Do you remember 1999? This book gives you the backstory and explains everything. Makes all those movies a lot better in hindsight. John Dos Passos, Manhattan Transfer. I read this at the beginning of the year. I actually read it sitting within the Ithra library in Saudi Arabia. I don't remember a thing about it. Sorry. One author that I found this year who I thought was absolutely tremendous was John Edgar Wideman. He has a tremendous book called Philadelphia Fire, which is about his own personal reckoning with the MOVE bombings. And then after I read that, I picked up his Complete Stories collection, which is a published collection of 3 books of short stories that he wrote. John Edgar Wyman was mostly based out of Pittsburgh, a tremendous writer who could really capture the language and the vocabulary of like the decline of urban America and why it's so important to preserve our cities. Related on a sci-fi front, William Gibson's Neuromancer, did not like it. Michael Zapata's The Lost Book of Adana Moreau, did not like it. Science fiction does not do it for me. The closest thing to science fiction that I did enjoy this year was Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, because I think Kurt Vonnegut had an ability to communicate science fiction to people like me who don't care for science fiction, which I know that, you know, as someone who likes Star Wars is funny for me to say, but I like Star Wars because I saw it when I was a kid. Clan of the Cave Bear, Gene M. Owl. This is kind of like good, cozy, somewhat pointless, really fun read, really fun exploration into prehistoric man. And what's great about her is that she did all of her research just in the 70s in a library in Portland. Her later books, it's an entire series called Earth's Children. She later goes on archaeological digs. She meets with researchers and professionals to better hone her like scientific points in her writing, but her exploration of what it meant to be early man and how man began to differentiate itself from apes and even just plant life is really incredible. Wilfred Sheed's Office Politics. This is a British man trying to make sense of the craziness of American work life. It's based in the 60s in New York City. Just a super fun book to read. And Tommy Orange's There. This is based in Oakland, California. This is the only piece of Native American literature that I read this year. It's an incredible exploration on what it means to be Native American in this terrifying day and age. I also finally had the guts to read J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, which I had always heard was this book that creates like incels and really terrible people. And what I found was if that's the takeaway you get out of this book, then I think you have poor reading comprehension. J.D. Salinger made something really special and incredible, and a marvelous time capsule to that exact moment in the late 40s in the United States, kind of what was going on in the zeitgeist. Norman Mailer, I read his book that covered the 1967-68 Republican National Convention and Democratic National Convention. It's called Miami and the Siege of Chicago. Norman Mailer, I've heard him described as like the most fun misanthropy to read, and I would completely agree with that. And folks, it's getting dark. Should we hurry things up? I think we should. I want to talk about 2 heavyweights of American literature. So again, I finally had the courage to read Herman Melville's Moby Dick. I think you can say that this is a strange book, a book that pushes all the limits of what we have come to understand a novel is and should be. Absolutely ahead of its time, really prescient of what would happen with modernism and postmodernism. Moby Dick is incredible. It should be studied, I think, more like a religious text than a straight-up novel that you read page to page. But when I read it page to page, I still had a great time. And of course, Thomas Pynchon. This man came into my life and has changed it. It feels like everything pales in comparison to the mental strain you go through to just understand what's going on in a Pynchon novel. I started with The Crying of Lot 49. It's his shortest and regarded as, of his earliest works, the most accessible. And then I spent several months hacking my way through Gravity's Rainbow. I found Gravity's Rainbow to be so profound and confusing, I had to read it a second time as soon as I finished it the first time. And then I finally understood after reading with study guides, following with a podcast and everything. I needed a lot of help to get through Gravity's Rainbow, but it was, to me, completely worthwhile. His books are a testament to what literature can be. What happens if we decide, let's really push the boundaries here. Okay, then I want to just talk very quickly. Oh my goodness, I want to go through the European literature that I read this year. Over the summer, I went to Sweden and I read a couple of things to prepare me for that. Torgny Lindgren's Hash, which is just a fun romp of this handful of people traveling around the country looking for the best recipe for hash, which is a Swedish home comfort meal. And also I read August Strindberg's The Red Room. This is regarded as one of the first satires ever written. It's a scathing review of Swedish culture. at the very end of the 19th century. Strindberg, if I'm not mistaken, was friends with Ibsen, and I have a collection of Ibsen plays I plan to read next year that's on my list as well. Colm Tóibín, I'm actually going to be seeing him in April at the library in Philadelphia for the release of his new books. I've always heard about how tremendous Irish literature is, and this was the first Irish novel I ever read, The Heather Blazing. Just phenomenal, just incredible. That man really can write. Halldór Laxness, Independent People, which is regarded as kind of like the novel to read about Iceland. I felt like it was overwritten. I really did. George Sand, Marianne, I talked about this when I read Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, but Flaubert and Sand were really good friends in Paris during the 19th century. Phenomenal writers who were really pushing the bounds of literature for the time, which makes them worth studying. I read Kafka's The Metamorphosis for the first time. I made a video about this, but Olga Tokarczuk's Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, tremendous novel. And I would like to also mention Alba de Céspedes, A Forbidden Notebook. Alba de Céspedes is related to many of the figures during the Cuban Revolution movement, and Alba lived a lot of her life in Italy, which is where the book Forbidden Notebook takes place. It's all about exploring a woman's role in the home after World War II. A incredible novel about one woman trying to break free pretty much accidentally from the incredibly suffocating roles of motherhood, of wifehood, of daughterhood. It reminded me so much of, I'm going to mess up her name, but Tove Ditlevsen of Denmark. Her also very scathing takedowns of our assumptions of what a good housewife must be. I'll mention the very last book I read for the year. I'm just about to finish it right now, is Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. I read this in college, skimmed it, didn't care for it then, but now I'm an adult with actual brain cells, and oh my goodness, this is an incredible novel. The way Virginia Woolf could get inside of someone's head, and her sentences that just flow on and on and on are an emotional event. To go through this book sentence by sentence. And now, with the very last light of the evening, I want to go into the everything else. 3 last books I want to tell you about. 1, Disney's Land, Richard Snow. This is an overly sentimental historical account of like how they built Disneyland out in California. I worked there very briefly in my early 20s. The book, it's way overboard with the love and esteem for a theme park, and look, I'm someone who likes theme parks. Jamaica Kincaid, I wanted to read A Small Place, which is a very famous short novella that she wrote, which is basically like, as a tourist, how do you go somewhere and understand like what's real, what's fake, and how do you not screw everything up by showing up as a tourist? And Mr. Potter is very similar with that in its aims and goals, and Jamaica Kincaid writes incredibly poetically about her home in Antigua. And lastly, the first time I ever read South African literature, J.M. Coetzee's Disgrace. I was really nervous about, do I care what a white guy has to say about South Africa? I don't, but he proved me otherwise, because the reviews I saw forced me to really engage with the book and see what he had to say. And he actually approaches the topic of white people in South Africa in a very profound and thought-provoking way. It's a book I think you have to read, and then we can talk about it, and I'd love to talk about it with you, because I have another book of his on my list for 2026. Holy cow, this was half an hour and the sun's gone. I'm sitting here in the dark, and just want to thank so much if you made it all the way through this video. I want to make more talking about books in the future, because it's fun for me to do, and I hope you enjoy it as well. So if you made it this far, Happy New Year.